Can you hear me? There we go. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the brave souls who made it through the rain and got a car wash to get here. I know some of you are going to be joining online. I'm guessing we're having more folks joining online tonight. I hope you're comfortable in your homes and enjoying a glass of wine or whatever it is you're enjoying. There are going to be some things that are not going to be as good online tonight, so I'm sorry that you're there. But we are going to dive in. Tonight's class, and we're going to have some more time for Q&A at the end. I'm going to leave. There's less material to cover tonight, so I'm going to go a little slower, and we will get through about 1,000 years of history. Our class is going to end in the early 19th century, so the early 1800s, as that kind of marks the beginning of the what I would call the modern Jewish period. For those who are in our Intro to Judaism class, we're going to continue with the second trimester in January, and we will at some point come back to more of the modern Jewish living things. But for this class, Jewish history, we're going to really build up to the modern era. And I wanted to begin tonight with a quote from the rabbi who, this buzzes now, that's fun, from a rabbi named Mordechai Kaplan. Mordechai Kaplan he wrote a book in 1934 called Judaism as a Civilization. And that book was so fundamental to American Jewish thinking that two of my teachers, Rabbi David Ellenson and Rabbi Michael Marmer, wrote an entire book called American Jewish Thought Since 1934. And the idea of their book was that 1934 was the hinge point, and that anything that comes afterwards in American Jewish thinking is shaped by Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan. I have some news. You're all Kaplan Jews, all right? This guy is your stuff. If you're looking for a book to read, it's dense, but Judaism as a Civilization is a great book. And he has one line in it that I love to frame tonight's class, which is he says, there are those who try to interpret Judaism to the outside, those who try to interpret Judaism to the outside world are in the habit of describing it in terms which they imagine would justify its existence in the opinion of their audience. So what does that mean? He says, when we're trying to explain who or what Jews are, we tend to do so in a way that makes sense in the world around us. So let's say, hypothetically for a second, Judaism is a radical new idea to think about the world differently. Now, if you actually want a radical new idea to take hold among people, you have to explain it in a way that they can understand. So 3,000 years ago, in a world that was surrounded by gods and had temples, surely Judaism, trying to explain this idea in a context people can understand, would do so in the context of gods and a god, singular, and Judaism. Then, as the world shifted, and we met last week Hellenism and the Greek philosophers who started thinking about the world as philosophy, Judaism similarly shifted and started to think of itself as a philosophy. And the book that we talked about at the end of the class last week, the Talmud, which is the project of the rabbis, is really a philosophical document. It's a philosophical way of life or way of living that was supposed to animate how each Jew went through the world. It was different than the Greeks, but it was done in a style that the Greeks would be familiar with. In tonight's class, we're going to get two new ways in which people think about the world and in which Judaism defined itself via those ways. The first of which is religion. So in the medieval period, religion is all of a sudden the hot new thing. We see the rise of Christianity and Islam, both of which are going to be fundamental to our class tonight. Their own stories are going to be relevant to the Jewish story in a significant way. And Judaism, too, transformed itself in the medieval period to thinking of a religion. There were people who said, Judaism has to have these doctrines, these things you need to believe in order to be Jewish. That was the first time anyone had said that. And that reflects, in a lot of ways, Christianity or Islam. And then finally, when we're going to get to the end of the class, we're going to get to this concept that was breaking hold in the world. We're going to talk deeply about why, which is the idea of nationalism. And Judaism thinks of itself naturally in this time period as a nation, as a people that deserve to have a state or a place like anybody else. So that's a little bit of the journey of where we're going to go. And I love this quote from Kaplan because it's a reminder that Jews, we interact with and we engage with the world, and that we try to describe ourselves to people around us in ways that make sense. If you're wondering, like, what does that look like today, or what does that look like in the future, that's a different class, and I have no idea. I think the world is, I will say, I think we're undergoing a pretty significant change right now. I thoroughly believe that the internet and all that has come with it is a pretty radical transformation of the way that human beings relate to each other, relate to their state, and relate to how we kind of figure out how to place ourselves. I'm banking on the fact that I'm not going to be alive long enough to see what that actually looks like. And so it's going to be future generations' problems. But there is a big question, I think, of what the future holds with this. One more thing before we start, which I have this picture I found on the internet of an accordion. And I love the accordion as a metaphor for something you see throughout Jewish history, in particular in this class, which is that Judaism and the Jewish people tend to have periods in which we are very tight, and we are in very particular, narrow places, usually very concentrated. I will say today, right now, even though it doesn't feel like it, we're living in one of those narrow places. Jews are all over the world, but we're really in two places. We're really in the United States and really in Israel, right? The vast majority of Jews live in those two spots. And then there are periods where Jews spread out. Now, I think the accordion might be widening itself a little bit right now, but there are periods where Jews go from place to place, and you're going to see in tonight's class the ways in which the Jewish community expands to different parts of the world, and in other times when it contracts and really finds itself in narrow spots. Which means we're going to begin, are we good? I'm not going to ask for any questions just yet. All right. Which begins with a period of Jewish history that is often overlooked. So as a reminder, last class, we talked about the rabbis, and we talked about the rabbinic way of thinking, which was to create Jewish life in a world that wasn't bounded by the Second Temple. And there were sort of two groups of rabbis. There were rabbis who were living in the land of Israel, and there were rabbis who were living in Babylon. The rabbis who were living in the land of Israel really struggled to keep hold there after the Bar Kokhba revolt, which we talked about last time, was a very significant revolt against the Romans, and we know you don't want to revolt against the Romans. It doesn't go well. So the rabbis who are in Babylon are the ones who tend to really grow, and Babylonia is a center of Jewish life. And the Geonim come later. Babylonia for the rabbis is like 300 to 700 CE. All right, now we're talking in post-zero here. And the successors to the rabbi are this group of people called the Geonim. Gaon in Hebrew is wise. So these are the wise people. And the Geonim did a few things that were essential to shaping Jewish reality today. One of which is they finally centralized the calendar. Previously, you might have had a world in which one Jewish community here was saying, today's Rosh Hashanah, and another Jewish community over here was saying, no, it's actually tomorrow because the sun or the moon over here is setting this way. They'd have these arguments between these communities, and the Geonim set the calendar for us that we use from here on out. So in about the year 900, the Jewish calendar is set. Now, I know that seems kind of like insignificant unless you're a calendar nerd, but setting the calendar is a huge way of centralizing power, and it's unifying. It brings Jewish people, especially as they spread out over all sorts of different places, together by saying we actually all follow the same calendar. Our calendar is one of the oldest calendars out there, but there were disagreements about it, and they basically ended all of those disagreements. The other thing that they did is they came up with what we call the Siddur, or the prayer book. For those who are in the intro class, you had a class with Robin Kosberg that was all about the prayer book that we use today. But this concept of having a singular book where you go that has all of the places for all of the prayers, the Geonim are the first ones to come up with that. And they sort of, their prayer book is not the same as it was then, but we actually have some of their old prayer books from like the years 900 CE. And so we know what was in it, and we can see what's been added and what's different. But they also finalized our prayer. And they contrast with this group of people called the Karaites. So the Karaites we're going to talk more about in a second. But the Karaites were a group of people, the Geonim were the successors of the rabbis, who were the successors of the Pharisees. And the word Pharisee means interpretation. So the rabbis are the interpreters, and the Geonim are also interpreters. We're going to talk about what that means. I'm going to give you an example of that in a second. The Karaites were very anti-interpretation. They wanted to read the Torah exactly as it was, and they're going to run into some problems, and there are very few Karaites left today. But, yeah?
So the paragraph, this is before Gutenberg and the printing.
Correct. Yes, and there is not a standard. There's never been a standard prayer book. Because if you go to Shereth Israel, there's a different prayer book. And if you go to, there's a standard prayer book for some Jews, Reformed Jews. In the United States, someone tried to come up with Minhag America, right? This is the American prayer book. It lasted for a couple years, right? There's not one exact prayer book, but the idea of having a book where you have all of the prayers written down in one place. And Sadia Gaon, who is the leading figure of the Geonim, I don't think I have him on your key term sheet, but he is a big name in this period. And he's really the one who kind of finalizes the institutionalization of having more of a fixed routine prayer. Fixed is probably the key word there, a fixed prayer. Any other questions about the Karaites? No, sorry, about the Geonim? Yes, Howard. Yeah. Spread out. Right. So part of it is, I'm not going to give a full answer to that because that itself could be an hour-long discussion. Part of it is the Torah. So many of the holidays are instituted by the Torah, and the other holidays that spring up around it are historical. So historical, like Hanukkah, or pseudo-historical, like Purim, or if you think about the Israeli high holidays, right? Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut, Yom HaShoah, which are modern Jewish holidays. Those are added in because of historical events. So for now, the answer is it's because the Torah tells us. All right? Great. But before we do that, oh no, my little slide is off. The one Charter of Spire is supposed to be over there. You don't need to read all these things. All right? I'm giving you those as an example here. As I mentioned, the two big changes in the world at this time period are the introduction of Christianity and Islam as ruling forces, all right? Different times in which they emerged, but suddenly Jews found themselves living what historians would say are under crescent or under cross, right? Living in Muslim lands or Muslim territories and living in Christian territories, which meant that Jews were subject to certain rules when they were living in those places. Now, it wasn't uniform. There is not one rule in one place that was applied to all places. I'm going to start on y'all, if you're looking at it at the left side, which is the Pact of Umar. The Pact of Umar was an agreement by one of the successors of Muhammad that outlined what the relationship and the role of Jews was going to be when they lived in Muslim lands. This was not ever actually followed. All right? There was no Muslim caliphate that actually implemented it exactly the way that Umar says here. And also, it was a guidepost for how Muslims and Jews related to one another. Also, by the way, the Muslims applied this to the Christians as well. So some examples of things that the Pact of Umar outlined were no new synagogues or churches. That ended up being not feasible at a certain point, and so it shifted oftentimes to be no synagogues or churches that were taller than any mosques, right? You see no repairing churches or synagogues. That the Jewish quarters needed to open their gates to Muslim passersby. They, interestingly, different from the Christians, did not want Jews or Christians teaching their children the Quran. They didn't want there to be any sort. They did have a special kind of place for Jews and Christians that was different. I am not an expert on Islam, so I'm gonna not get all this stuff exactly right. And they asked Jewish people not to imitate Muslim dress or adopt Muslim speech or take on Muslim surnames or sell Muslims wine. They didn't want Jews wearing swords. So this is kind of an outline of ways in which Jews are categorized in Muslim countries, all right? Particularly the big Muslim country, which we're going to get to in a second, is Spain. All right, so Spain is the place where this is really, it's improper to call it Spain. The word technically should be Al-Andalusia. We'll talk about that in a minute. And in Al-Andalusia, the way that Jews related to Muslims, this is also the case, though, in Babylon, where there was a shrinking Jewish community. Now, the other one, on the other side here, and I'm sorry my slide's a little messed up, but Charter of Speyer should be on the right side, is about this town called Speyer. Speyer it's on the Rhine River in Germany. So there's a little section in between where France and Germany are that France and Germany have fought over for like 1,000 years, all right? Alsace-Lorraine, right, that area. And the Rhine River runs through it. And there are a couple of towns that were the big cities that Ashkenazi Jews moved to. And this area is called Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz does not mean Poland, all right? Now, Jews from Ashkenaz, meaning this little river area between what's today France and Germany, eventually moved to Poland and eventually moved to the United States. So Ashkenazi Jews come from this place, all right, but have gone to other places as well. The big town, there are 3 big towns. They're called the Shum cities, which is Hebrew for garlic. Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. If you're looking for a fun little trip around Germany, go to Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. They have neat histories. If you know anyone with the last name Shapiro, that means they come from Speyer. Okay? That's what the Jewish last name Shapiro means. And the way it worked in Speyer, and in many communities in Ashkenaz, was that the leader, in this case it was a bishop whose name was Rudiger, all right, would make an agreement to bring Jews into his town. The reason he wanted to bring Jews into his town is he thought it would be financially advantageous. You might ask, why would it be financially advantageous to bring Jews into your town? Well, the Jews who moved to Ashkenaz probably came from Italy, which meant they had connections to relatives of theirs who lived in Italy, which meant they had the ability to run trade routes between the Romans, who could further connect their trade to the Middle East, which is a boom town at this time, and get things like spices from India. All of this is trade connected. And someone like Bishop Rudiger of Speyer would say, I'm going to beat these other towns by welcoming in Jews, and I'm going to give a special role to these Jewish people. The Jewish people are going to be protected by me. I'm going to encircle them in a wall so that the other people in my town don't go attacking these Jews because, according to their way of thinking, Jews were responsible for killing their Lord and Savior. So there's a problem here, right? So he said, I'm going to protect these Jews by building a wall around them, and I'm going to charge them rent to live in their ghetto. The word ghetto is not exactly right here because the word ghetto is an Italian word, all right? But it's 1500s Italian word, but this is like a proto-ghetto. The Jews were all stuck in one corner of town. The Jews, though, had certain rights. They could buy and sell and exchange anything and everything they used, including gold. He gave them their own cemetery in the town. It's a pretty big deal to have access to something like that. When another Jewish person was visiting, they wouldn't have to pay a toll the way someone else might need to in their town. You can see what's going on there is, okay, so when cousin Shlomo comes up from Rome with a bunch of good spices to bring to my town, right, we're going to let him come stay here without charging him any extra. It's lowering tariffs, right? It's making things a little easier for trade to happen, all right? And the other big thing that I want to highlight from here is that the Jewish community was responsible for managing its own issues. Meaning, if 2 Jewish people had a conflict with one another, the bishop was not going to deal with it. The Jewish community would deal with it, which gave a lot of power to one group of people in particular, which was called the Kehillah, or the board of the community, that usually featured rabbis, all right? So the rabbis could tell the Jewish community what to do. I'm going to hold on that because we're going to get more into it later. All right? So this is just 2 examples of what's going on, generally the landscape in the medieval period of Jews and their relationship to Muslims and Jews and their relationships to Christians. All right? So I have here a nice little map of Ashkenaz, all right? So you can see the Rhine River and all the towns with the little square, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz are right there. And that is where Ashkenazi Jews come from, all right? Let's talk about Ashkenaz, all right? So Ashkenazi Jews there was a golden period for Jewish Ashkenaz, but it wasn't that great. Because Jews in Ashkenaz, as you might have seen from the Charter of Speyer, didn't quite fully have integration into the larger community. That's not going to be the case in Spain under Muslim rule. There's going to be much more freedom, it's not the exact right word, but freedom for Jews in Muslim lands than there is in Christian lands, all right? And things started out, the Jews were brought to Ashkenaz, and it ended poorly very quickly. The first Crusades come in 1096, and the Crusaders are like, we're going to go free the Holy Land, and we're going to start out by killing all the infidels that are living among us. And they killed a bunch of Jews, all right, in the year 1096. It was very rough. But within this, there's an extraordinary tradition that emerges of Jewish commentary. To this day, if you take a Torah study class, the first person you are going to stop and meet is a guy by the name of Rashi, all right? Rashi is a very important Jewish figure, all right? Rashi is an acronym. His name is Rabbi Shimon ben Yitzchak. That's what gets you Rashi, all right? So Rashi was a rabbi. He was on the French side of things. When you read Rashi in the original commentary, occasionally you get to a word and you're like, what's that? And it's some obscure medieval French word, all right? So he's writing in France. And Rashi did the most deep dive of a commentary on the Torah. And he did 2 things in his Torah commentary. Number 1, I want you to think back to the accordion here, all right? Number 1, Jews are moving all over the place here, all right? So there's a lot of text that's probably being lost. And Rashi took a lot of stories that the rabbis told, and he directly about the Torah, and he directly connected them into the Torah, all right? He would say here, you know, there's this, I'll give a very famous example. We have a story about Abraham and his father's idol shop. That is not in the Torah. It is the most famous Abraham story, that Abraham's father ran an idol shop, and he was working in the idol shop, and one day his father Terach was out, and he brought a stalk of wheat. Someone brought a stalk of wheat to offer to the idols, and Abraham smashed all the idols, except for the biggest one, which he placed the wheat in its hand, his father came back and said, Abraham, like, what's going on? Why did these idols, what happened? And Abraham said, well, they all got up and fought one another over this sacrifice, and they smashed each other. To which his father said, they're just stone statues. Of course they didn't do that. And Abraham says, and that's why idolatry is ridiculous, right? So that's a great story. It's not in the Torah. But Rashi helps point you to that story's existence. So his commentary includes a connection to certain stories. And it does something that I call my favorite game, What's Bothering Rashi? Meaning, the Torah, as I mentioned in the first class, is confusing. And there were things that bothered Rashi. There were problems in the text of the Torah, and he wanted to explain or interpret them. I'm going to give you an example here. There's a line in Exodus that says, you shall kindle no fire throughout your settlements on the Sabbath day. This is pretty fundamental Jewish text. Don't light lights on Shabbat. Now, the question that is bothering Rashi is, what does the word day mean? All right? So I gave you 3 examples here of what the word day means. On the farthest side, we have a sunshine, meaning it's not day right now because the sun has set and it's no longer the day. That is one meaning of the word day. That's not the only meaning of the word day, because next to it I have a running little emoji clock thing, and that is an indication that sometimes we say, oh, yesterday or the day before, right? And that is referring to the whole 24-hour period beforehand. That's different than the daytime when the sun is up, but it's the same word. There's a third definition of the word day, which I have from Star Wars, right? A long time ago in a galaxy far away. It didn't actually have the word day in it, but we would say today in English, back in the day, right? Day can also refer to an eon or a period of time. Now, Rashi actually doesn't give a commentary on this, but there's a bunch of people, well, Rashi has his thoughts, but there's a lot of commentaries on this text. The conclusion by the Gaonic Jews and the rabbinic Jews of this time period is that the word day depends on the context, right? We can't tell you that just because it says day, it means all of these things, it means the same thing in every place, all right? Just because it says, you shall kindle no fire throughout your settlements on the Sabbath day, we can deduce which one we're talking about here. The Karaites, the group I mentioned before, they're the strict interpreters. And they say the only acceptable use of the word day is when the sun is out. So how does this look different in practice? Well, Jewish people do this thing when Shabbat starts. We light 2 candles. And actually, usually that means there are other candles that are lit in the house, which means when you celebrate Shabbat on Friday night, you have festive, joy, celebration. The lights are on, so to speak, all right? And eventually, in the olden days, they would burn out, and you would go to bed. But Jewish people, rabbis understood, rabbinic Jews understood, that we have to enjoy the celebration of Shabbat, and that means it's okay to have candles lit in the evening. That's how we interpret the word day here, all right? The Karaites have Shabbat in the dark. They say when it says kindle no fire throughout your settlements on the Sabbath day, that means no candles, meaning you sit in the dark by yourself at night on Shabbat, all right? It's a literal interpretation, and it's a disagreement, and the rabbis win, all right? But this is an example of a close reading of a text that Rashi does in his commentary. He picks up on nearly every word in the Torah, and he does it in the entire Hebrew Bible, and he actually comments on the entire Talmud. And frankly, it is impossible to study any of those texts with any meaning without getting to our friend Rashi. Rashi is the quintessential Ashkenazi voice. Now, you'll note that Rashi is focused on religious matters, all right? Rashi does not write much about secular living. He's really specifically narrowed in to Jewish text and Jewish life through text, which is a gift to those of us who love text study, but it's going to differ from those in Spain, where there's a lot more secular living that comes across in their texts. So if one were to make a graph of how Ashkenazi Jews went, it was like a little bump up here, and then things collapsed, all right? Now, you saw the same thing happen here with Poland. They did the same thing that Bishop Rudiger did of Speyer. When the Jews were kicked out of England or France or different parts of Germany, the Poles were like, we'll bring them in. We need to grow our economy over here too, right? So Ashkenazi Jews shift east to Poland because of that. But the period of Ashkenaz has kind of a little bump that's really focused on religious living and then declines pretty rapidly in the face of expulsion and attack. Any questions about Ashkenazi Jews? American Jews, by the way, the vast majority of American Jews are Ashkenazi Jews. Something like 60, I think the latest Pew numbers show about 70% are Ashkenazi, about 5% are Sephardic, and about 25% are kind of fit in the category of other. American Jews primarily descend from Ashkenazi Jews who mostly moved east. All right? That's Ashkenaz. And next we're going to move to Sfarad. Sfarad is the Hebrew word, yes?
So, before I go on.
Yeah.
So the peak is in what century is that?
I would put this year at 1096. And the reason I would do 1096 is that's the year of the First Crusade, and things go downhill pretty shortly thereafterwards. The first country, or the first place to really kick Jews out is not long after that. It's England. There's something called the Blood Libel that happens in England, and they kick the Jews out. They blamed a Jewish person for killing a kid. Probably not true. That starts off 1,000 years of that, by the way. And they kicked all the Jews out of England. The other thing is, in this time period, Christians were not allowed to lend money to other Christians. So the Jews were the money lenders, right? So Jews became the bankers. And you need money lending if you want your economy to grow. If your objective is grow your economy, then you have to have some sort of banking system in order to make it happen. And when a leader of a little principality would lend money to a Jewish person and then would owe interest on that money. After a certain amount of time, they would say, well, why don't we just kill him or kick him out instead? And so that often happened, and that's part of why you saw the Ashkenazi Jews really shift east. Great question. Any other questions about Ashkenazi Jews? Okay, let's go to Spain, Sfarad. So Sfarad is the Hebrew word for Spain. So the other type of Jew you're going to hear in the world is Sephardic Jews. It's a little limiting, but the reason Sephardic Jews are called Sephardic Jews is because they spoke Spanish actually long after leaving Spain. There's an incredible story of a Spanish ambassador to the Ottoman Empire who was in Salonika, Greece. Which is a super Jewish city in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And he's walking around and he says, why do I understand the language being spoken at restaurants and coffee shops? And it's because Sephardic Jews were still speaking Spanish 400 years after having left Spain in Greece. It's kind of you have to really wrap your mind around that one. And it's a little complex, but that is the Jews of Spain. And this random map I got from the internet shows the peak of the Caliphate of Cordoba. So in Spain, in the 9 to 1100s, there was probably Spain in the 9 to 1100s is one of the most tolerant societies in the world, in that Jews and Muslims and Christians largely were given the ability to get along with each other, which meant that they could live next to each other and learn from each other and didn't have, the society was fundamentally tolerant. It was also extremely advanced. One of the cities, I forget if it was Toledo or Cordoba, one of the big cities at that time period actually had like lights outside that lit up their city. They had enough resources to be able to manage street lights, which is pretty impressive 1,000 years ago. All right, so that is life in Spain. And the Jewish community there, like the Jews of Ashkenaz, also added a lot of commentary on the Torah and commentary on the Talmud and had deep passion for those topics. They produced also these beautiful commentaries as well. The biggest one is from a guy by the name of Ibn Ezra. All right, so Ibn Ezra is also, he's a grammar nerd, so if you like grammar and you want to pick into the Torah's grammar, the person you're going to want to talk to is Ibn Ezra. All right, but unlike Ashkenaz, which really kind of collapsed here, Spain was really a nice big success story for a while. And we see that in the fact that the Jewish community there was able to adopt elements of secular culture as well. Meaning, the leading Jews weren't just doing Torah commentaries. They weren't just focused on Jewish issues. They were writing love poetry. Because Muslims at this time period wrote this beautiful love poetry, and Jews adopted it too. So I'm going to give you the most probably famous example is from a guy named Judah Halevi. And Judah Halevi wrote this poem that is very well known 1,000 years ago, which says, "My heart is in the east." And he writes, "My heart is in the east, and I in the uttermost west. How can I find savor in food? How shall it be sweet to me? How shall I render my vows and my bonds, while yet Zion lies beneath the fetter of Edom, and I in Arab chains? A light thing would it seem to me to leave all the good things of Spain, seeing how precious in my eyes to behold the dust of the desolate sanctuary." He's writing here, Judah Halevi, in the 1100s, is writing here about the land of Israel, all right? And he's writing about his own experience being stuck in exile in Spain and wishing for the ability to one day have a Jewish community that's back and living in the land of Israel. Now, the thing you'll note with this is he's got some, while I live in Arab chains, you have to have a certain level of tolerance in a society for someone to be able to write and publish something like this. If Rashi had said, "My heart longs for the east, but I'm stuck here in Bishop Rudiger of Speier's utter chains," it wouldn't have gone so well, right? Because there was not tolerance for Jews to be able to do much besides care about Jewish life there. Whereas in Spain, in Sfarad, the Jewish community could have a huge impact on life there. You see here, it's not the first iteration of it, it's not the last iteration of it, but the role of the court Jew, meaning a Jewish person who is deeply involved and connected to the royalty or the nobility, that was a common thing in Sfarad. So the leader of the Jewish community might have been one of the king or leader's prime ministers, all right? And that is common in this time period. My favorite little fun fact about this is if you look at the flag of Portugal. Are people familiar with the flag of Portugal? You can kind of imagine it in their head. There's a little, it's called an astrolabe on it, all right? It's a little device that was significant for the Portuguese because with the invention of this device, you could leave the coastline and you could go explore beyond about 30 miles from the coast safely, which led to the era of exploration and the boom of Portugal. The astrolabe was invented by a rabbi named Abraham Zacuto, okay? So the Portuguese flag, which 0 people in Portugal know this, all right, was the Portuguese ability to be this massive empire that it was predicated on the fact that a Jewish person who was obsessed with calendars was looking at the stars and figured out how to map them out, and that allowed someone to navigate out in the ocean in a new way. Right? So you see a huge impact. That's an example of an impact that the Jewish community had in that time period. The best person for this, though, is a guy by the name of the Rambam. All right? So that's a little picture of him. I don't know why that's a picture of him, but that's a picture of the Rambam. We probably have no idea what he actually looked like. But the Rambam was born in Spain. He was born in Spain, like, right here. All right? So he's kind of on the edge of the golden age of Spanish Jewry. And the Rambam, when he is a young man, a group from Morocco takes over Spain, a Muslim group, and kind of ends the era of tolerance. At the same time, the Christians are trying to take Spain back. So the war between Muslims and Christians in Spain is brewing, and Jews get stuck in the middle of it. The Rambam actually goes down to live in Morocco for about 10 years, where he is kind of possibly openly a Muslim and secretly a Jew. His family then moves to Israel for a couple years. It's like full of malaria, and there's not much in the way of anything there. And he eventually settles in Cairo in Egypt, all right? The Rambam, by the way, is sometimes also called Maimonides, all right? The word Rambam is an acronym, like Rashi. You know how we call presidents with the 3-letter names from like a specific window of time? It's like FDR, JFK, LBJ, right? That's like we don't really do that anymore today. It's the same with these little weird rabbi names. We don't do it today. But the rabbi name is Rambam is an acronym for Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, meaning his name was Moses and his father's name was Maimon, so his name is Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, or the Rambam. There's a saying about the Rambam, from Moses to Moses, there was no one like Moses, all right? He is as significant of a figure in Jewish history as there is, all right? And he, as I mentioned earlier with the court Jew thing, was the chief doctor for the Sultan of Egypt. So he had a day job, all right? And a pretty important one, all right, to be a physician. But in his evening job or his weekend job, he produced 3 extraordinary books. And the first was a commentary on the Mishnah. You remember last week, from last time, the Mishnah was the book of Jewish law that was codified by Judah Halevi. If you forget, it's okay. I won't judge you. You can go back and watch it again or look at your notes, all right? And the Mishnah, as we said, was a little confusing, and so the Rambam starts with a commentary on the Mishnah, but that's really forming the basis of something called the Mishnah Torah. And I bolded the Mishnah Torah because it is arguably the most important Jewish book in its time period. The Rambam moved a lot throughout his life. And he noticed Jews were moving a lot throughout their lives. And he was worried, as the accordion was swinging out, that people would forget how to practice Judaism. And the Talmud is super complicated. And so the Rambam wrote a law code. And it is in very plain Hebrew. If you don't speak much Hebrew, you can open up the Mishnah Torah and actually get a sense of what's going on, except for that the whole beginning is about Greek philosophy, okay? So the Rambam dives in with this thing called the Mishnah Torah. It's 14 volumes, and it's meant to be a simple law code, all right? We have here the first medieval Jewish law code. It's different than the commentaries, because the commentaries help you understand the Torah and learn, but the law code helps you actually figure out and practice Jewish life. all right? He covers every topic on it, and there have been a bunch of law codes that have been written since then, and none of them are as expansive or cover as many materials as the Mishnah Torah does. The only problem is he doesn't cite his sources. So we don't know 100% where some of the things come from. Many of the laws of conversion that we know today come from the Rambam's Mishnah Torah. We actually don't have a lot of the earlier sources on some of them. So we trust that he was basing things off of how the community functioned, but there are some questions about where he got some of the things that he did. All right? So this is the Rambam's Mishnah Torah. It is an absolute magnum opus, and he follows it up by writing a book called The Guide for the Perplexed, which is an excellent example of Aristotelian philosophy for a Jewish person who is trying to square the circle of the Torah and the Greek philosophers. That in itself is a different class, but it's a good one for people who are trying to figure out how to deal with the complexity of the world and looking at the Torah literally and how we kind of think those things through. And so that is the Rambam in the Guide for the Perplexed. And even though he's not technically in Spain when he does all these things, he is a Sephardic Jew. He is a quintessential Spanish Jew. So those are the Jews of Sfarad. Like how the Jews of Ashkenaz, and the peak is right before the First Crusade, the Spanish, with the fights between the Muslims and the Christians, the Jews get sandwiched in it. This, I'm going to assume a lot of people know, because it's a pretty well-known story, but in 1391, a bunch of Jews are forcibly converted in Spain. When you forcibly convert someone, you have, as we've learned already in this class, all sorts of problems. So the Spanish have to create this thing called the Inquisition, which is to police belief among their forcibly converted members of their community. And they really finalized with kicking all of the Jews out in 1492. All right? Whole different story there of whether or not Columbus was one of these people who had been at some point forcibly converted and was looking for a way out. I don't fully buy that, although there are some who Spanish and Portuguese Jews like to argue that. Yeah.
Didn't they also kick out the Muslims?
Yeah. They kicked out Jews and Muslims at the same time. Yep. Yeah.
There was also a war between Catholics and Protestants.
Not yet. The question was about, what about the war between Catholics and Protestants? I think Martin Luther is like what year? 1590 something. So we're before that here. Any other questions about Sephardic or Spanish Jews? Yeah.
Well, I guess think about Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews. How did these two populations first end up in the Rhine Valley and also?
Yeah, so the Jewish community in Spain had actually been there probably for about 2,000 years. They were small. In the 8th century, so did I get that right? Yeah, in the 8th century, in the 700s, there was definitely a Jewish community there. They were badly oppressed by the Visigoths. Super random history here. Like, you do not need to remember any of this. And then they were rescued by the Muslims. And so there's a Jewish community in Spain for a long time. And Jews, as you kind of see, move for opportunity. I have a little fun fact about my family. No one in my family, my sister lives in the same city that she grew up in, and I think that's the first person in my family to do that in like a couple hundred years. Okay, Jews like to move. We're on the move. We go for new opportunities. We go to places where we go to places that are new and tolerant and growing and exciting because that's where we're welcome. And usually places at a certain point turn when they have growth and tolerance to a certain point. And that's just the history of these places, is they say, come on in, help us expand our trade. And then they turn on people who are a little different than them, and Jewish people are a very obvious different person, especially when the world is so focused on religion. We're going to get more into the medieval mindset in a little bit. We're doing great on time, though. Yes, in the back. A date on when Jews migrated to Poland? Yeah, and the answer to the Ashkenaz question is, there are some out there who argue that there were 8 Ashkenazi families, that all Ashkenazi Jews are descended from 8 families that moved to the Rhine Valley around the 800s or 900s. Poland comes after Jews start getting kicked out of places in Western Europe, the Poles say, let's bring over these people here because it'll be good for it'll help us grow. There were beginnings of Jews in Poland in the year 1000. It gets booming in like the 1400s. If you go to Warsaw, there's a museum of Jews in Poland, and they call it everyone says when Jews go to Poland, they just look at the Holocaust. And the Poles are trying to remind people that there was 1,000 years of Polish-Jewish history. The problem is it wasn't all good. But there was a Jewish community in Poland and Eastern Europe, definitely at that time period. Yes, Michael, and then one more, and yeah.
So, going back to Judah-El,
Yeah,
the other slide, references the word Zion.
yeah.
So, immediately I think about, is there somehow a connection, hundreds of years, between the philosophy of Judeo-Christian and sourcing
We are going to actually get into some of the origins of Zionism tonight, so we will see that, and I will let you all answer that question. There is certainly a longing for land and for place that underlies the Jewish story this entire time. Yes?
So in 1492, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain,
Yeah.
most of them moved south into Africa or east.
Good. So in 1492, when Spanish Jews are kicked out, most of them go to Portugal, where in 1497, the Portuguese say, we learned from the mistake of the Spanish, we're not going to kick them out, we're going to forcibly convert them, okay? And so there are a lot, if you go today and do DNA tests among Portuguese people, it's a bunch of people with a lot of Jewish DNA, all right, who were forcibly converted, and there were, up until the 20th century, early 20th century, there were a lot of people secretly practicing Jewish life in Portugal. The big places that Jews went to besides Portugal was the Ottoman Empire. It's the similar story of these people are going to help us with there's economic booms going on when you bring Jews around, right? So because they're allowed to it's the same story. You're allowed to lend money. It'll help our economy grow. So the Ottoman Empire brings in a lot of Jews, and so Sephardic Jews, by and large, end up settling in Greece and Turkey, with some in Italy. Italy's got a wild Jewish history, and I don't know a ton about it, but it's different than everywhere else. I have an Israeli friend who was trying to get Spanish citizenship, and his proof text was his grandparents' ketubah, which was in Ladino, in Spanish, Jewish Spanish. Yiddish is Jewish German, Ladino is Jewish Spanish. What it means to be Jewish German or Jewish Spanish is that it's mostly Spanish or mostly German with some weird Jewishisms and usually a few Hebraic syntax things. So that's kind of, and you can see some of that, and we're starting to see a little bit of it in English Jewish. I don't know if it's fully ever going to break hold, but that's basically the linguistic piece. And so that's why you saw in Turkey and in what's modern day Turkey and Greece, and starting to be also at that time period in the land of Israel itself, in a town called Sfat, which we're not going to talk about tonight. Yes?
I was under the impression somehow that when the Jews were expelled from Spain, that Poland, which had a hierarchy of soldiers, I guess, and peasants, but no middle class, they invited the Jews to come because they had been administrative leaders in Spain.
Excellent transition. I'm going to tell you one quick fun story about that. If you meet someone whose last name is Ashkenazi, they're Sephardic. And if you meet someone whose last name is Sephardi, they're Ashkenazi. Why, you say? Right? You'd think that would be the other way around. Well, one little Spanish Jew moved his way to Warsaw or whatever, and they were like, oh, this guy's Sephardi. He's the Sephardic one, so we're going to give him the last name Sephardic Jew. But then over hundreds of years, who is the one Sephardic Jew of Warsaw marrying a bunch of Ashkenazi Jews? So the great-great-great-grandkids are 80% Ashkenazi, 90% Ashkenazi, but they still hold on to the last name Sephardi, and it's the same thing with Ashkenazi. And Frosty transitioned us nicely to what we're going to do next, which is really getting into the origins of modern Judaism. And so if you are so sick of medieval Jewish history and you're bored out of your mind right now, raise your hand. Honest answers only. It's okay, you can say it. Medieval history, you either like it or you don't. We're going to get into the origins of modern Jewish life, all right? But before we do that, do we need a break? We good? We're good? Okay. All right. I want to share 2 myths, and this is the last PowerPoint, so we're done with PowerPoint here. 2 myths about modern Jewish life. Oh, I made the font so tiny on these. Sorry. Myth number 1, Orthodox Judaism is how it's always been. Then those reformers came and they changed everything. You hear that all the time in the Jewish world, all right? The Reform Jews, they messed with everything. They're not even Jews at this point anymore because they're making all these changes. That is a myth. We're going to see why in a second. The other myth is that Israel was founded because of the Holocaust. How many of you have heard someone say this before? In the last 2 years, I've had friends who have said this to me, not intentionally, with no malice whatsoever. They look at the Holocaust ending in 1945, and they look at Israel being founded in 1948, and they say, obviously, the world said we should give Israel a place because of the Holocaust. Wrong. Jews a place because, wrong. All right, and we're going to see why. All right, but to do that, first, we have to get into the contours of the I'm going to keep the myths up. We have to get into the contours of the medieval world, all right? So Frosty kind of led us into this a little bit, but there are a couple of, I need a new spot on my whiteboard for this. I didn't leave room for one thing here. We're going to use this middle spot here. Frosty pointed out that there are a couple of different groups of people in the medieval time period. So name one of the groups you threw out, Frosty. Well, no. That's among the Jews, right? Like I heard someone say peasants, right? The vast majority of people in the, we'll follow the French Revolution answer here, and we'll put them as number 3, all right? The French Revolution, they call them the Third Estate, right? So what is a peasant? Say it again. There was a whole book written on that. What is the Third Estate? What? Yeah, exactly. Okay, it's good. You're right. But what is a peasant? Huh? A worker. All right. Yeah. No, good. All right. You're stealing my other things already up here. Our other groups of people. They said non-clergy and non-noble people. All right. They were not landowners. All right. The peasants worked the land. All right. And what I'm doing is simple right now. I'm giving you the simple version of this. I know it's more complex than what I'm about to tell you, but I'm trying to get like 600 years of how people completely and radically changed the way that they understand their relationship to each other and their state in about 25 minutes, so it's going to be simple, all right? So peasants, right, they're tilling the land, all right? They kind of, their well-being is completely dependent upon the well-being of the local noble person. I'm going to put the noble person, and I'm going to put if you're online, I'm sorry if you can't. Although it's actually a pretty good spot. I'm going to put the royalty up here too, all right? The royalty and the nobility, they're kind of the same thing, all right? If you're a peasant and you're working your land, can you become a noble person? No. Right? Today we have this idea of, right, you can, huh? Unless you're Cinderella. Right, it is so remarkable that it's worthy of a story, all right? It is not easy in this day and age. If you're a peasant, your life is going to be the life, it doesn't sound fun to me, right? You are not going anywhere besides that little plot of land that you're working for your noble person. And your noble person is the person that is really in charge of you. All right? And the nobility, now, and it's different, France, Germany, England, Spain, they all have different relationships to this, all right? You know, in England, we all know the Magna Carta, the nobility got together, they managed their relationship with the king. In Poland, they had this whole different, the nobility structure, all right? But these are the 2 main groups of people. Your identity was rooted in your, I'm going to use the Marxist term for it, class, okay? When we say the word class today, it's not like what they're talking about back then. Because when you were in your class, you weren't going anywhere else, right? If you were a peasant class person, you're not becoming anything besides a peasant class person. But you mentioned there's another group of people up here. who kind of fit a little bit weirdly in between them. Where'd my pen go? Here we go. Which are the clergy, okay? The church. The church has kind of a weird spot here. And I don't know exactly the history of who became a clergy person was. Jews, by the way, like to hang out with the clergy people because the clergy people were the only ones that knew how to read, all right? And the Jews probably knew how to read. But sometimes the Jews didn't like to hang out with the clergy people because occasionally they'd be like, we're going to try and kill these Jews. And they would lead up the masses against them. Where do Jews fit into this? Where do Jews fit into this structure of the medieval world? Jews are definitely not landowners, and we're not peasants. And the kibbutzniks were the first real Jewish farmers in hundreds of years. Jews and farming and now we've done a little bit in America. We get a little bit of good on farming, American Jews, all right? But Jews did not farm. We did not make food. That was not our role, all right? So where do Jews fit into this? Huh? Merchants, okay. Huh? No, because there's like an artisan class that exists. Jews are outside of this structure. I don't know why I put a 4 here, right? Jews are over here, all right? As I mentioned earlier, the Jewish community, as a result of being different, being its own thing, and from what we read earlier with Bishop Rudiger, all right, the Jewish community was in charge of its own rules. The Jewish community in the medieval period was very tightly knit because the Kehillah would tell you what to do. John would be the architect, all right, naturally. He's an architect today. But it wouldn't be that John chooses to go to architecture school and become an architect, that someone in the Kehillah would say, this guy's going to be our architect. Someone else is going to be the teacher. Someone else is going to be the butcher. Someone else is going to be the what, right? People would the Kehillah would assign people's different jobs. If you wanted to leave the Kehillah structure, what would happen to you? You're out. You're no longer, they sit Shiva, you're dead, okay? You're no longer in the community. And your only chance of making it is if you convert to Christianity. I'm more focused on Europe here. So that's why I'm going to say Christianity, not Islam, although there are similarities, all right? So the Jewish community was run by this board, and you had to follow the rules of the Jewish community. The rules were different from place to place, all right? The Jews of Krakow had different rules than the Jews of Cordoba. Because Krakow and Cordoba are different places. They deserve to have different rules, okay? But the Jewish community had its own rules, and you had to follow it. Meaning if the rabbi told you that you had to keep kosher, you had to keep kosher. And your livelihood depended on it. Because if you broke a rule, then the community would punish you. And you did not want to be punished by the community, all right? This is the structure of the medieval world on a individual experience level. Want to highlight one key point again? I said it already, but I'm going to say it again. Your identity was tied into where you fit here. If you were a noble person, you thought of yourself as a noble person. You might be poor, but you were still nobility. And if you were a peasant, you thought of yourself as a peasant, all right? And if you were Jewish, you thought of yourself as a Jew. There wasn't a ton of osmosis between them. There were a couple Jews that left and became Christian. And I'm sure there were a couple people that accidentally married someone Jewish and kind of snuck their way in, all right? But by and large, the rules in the medieval period were fixed between the groups, all right? Then something comes along and breaks all of this up. And we call that the Enlightenment, all right? The Enlightenment doesn't happen in one night, of course, but it takes hold in 1 year, I think. But the Enlightenment has 3 key ideas. There are more than 3, but there are 3 big ideas of the Enlightenment that totally break apart this way of structure in the world. All right? Anyone want to guess what some of those ways are in which the Enlightenment changed this structure of the world? Yeah?
I would guess that all people have the same value.
Good. We call that in the modern world the natural rights. All right? Walter Isaacson just wrote a book about what he calls the best sentence of all time. And that best sentence of all time, Walter Isaacson says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. All right? Thomas Jefferson said it most clearly. That's what natural rights is. So what is natural rights? All right? Natural rights means that each individual person has certain inalienable rights that are predicated on the fact that they're a human being. How is that different than this? They had no rights here, or their rights were tied to how they were born, as opposed to their rights tied to being born. All right? And now the question is, what are those rights? And there are huge arguments in the Enlightenment about, is it property? Is it the pursuit of happiness? Right? Like, what do we mean by that? Right? But the concept that when you are born, you inherently have some person rights, that totally breaks the old structure of the world. Because suddenly, the peasant can think, oh, I deserve to have some rights too. All right? So that's number one. Free will, I'm going to lump in with natural rights. Well, actually, Howard, keep going with that for a second. Tell me more about why you mean free will. Good. I call that individualism. All right? Meaning, I'm not defined anymore by my group. My fate is not determined by where I fit in this structure. Instead, my fate is determined by me, because I'm an individual person. This is a radically different way about, I'm going to come back to this question I've mentioned a few times already, about thinking about an individual's relationship to other people in society and to their government. When you are an individual, you're suddenly thinking about the whole thing differently than when you were before a part of this group that then related. The Jewish community, by the way, here paid one tax. Today, Jews, we all pay our own different taxes, and Temple Emanu-El is taxed as a religious organization, right? But back in the day, in the medieval period, the Jewish community would get together. Usually they go to the one person who was the banker, and they would say, can you help us with the tax? And then they would pay the one lump sum tax. The academics call it a corporate structure. Jews, the Jewish community, operated more like American Airlines than anything else. There was a CEO, there was a board, people were assigned different jobs, and at the end of the year, when they would have a certain amount of profits, the government would come in and say, okay, you owe us this much. All right? Individualism breaks that whole thing up. You're no longer part of a corporation, you're your own individual thing. There's one more. Yeah. I'm going to lump those. Those are all ideas that get into what we would call then natural rights and individualism. Yeah, in the back. Science is in there. That's all connected and part of this. That comes through with these, right? And that kind of naturally happens. The big one is, before, if you were going to do something, it was because your noble person or your king told you to do it, or maybe the church leader told you to go fight for the king. So how are you going to, if you have a group of individuals all saying I'm an individual, it's actually going to be a bit of a hot mess. There's a great Onion article from like 20 years ago that said, new proposal for the Middle East, 330 million state solution, right? That's like each individual person should be their own state, because that's easier than whatever's happening right now. Pretty funny. And also, right, it's a bit chaotic. You can't have that. And so we have this concept that emerges at this time period of nationalism. How are you going to bring all of these nationalism. How are you going to bring all these individual people that each think they have their own rights together in some sort of coherent society? We're going to lump them together by language, all right? So you have here the emergence of the modern state, all right? The modern state being, we're going to get all the people who speak French and call them French people. And then they're going to be a part of the French state. And you're going to have all these people who speak English, and they're going to be part of the English people, and they're going to be part of England. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, one of them was Poland is for Poles, okay? Because Poland had been taken away from the Poles, but there was still a group of people that spoke Polish, and the solution to the problem of World War I, according to Woodrow Wilson, was, well, we need to make sure that groups of nations have their own access to their own individual state. Are we good?
Yeah.
Okay. This all came to a head in 1 year, all right? It was emerging slowly, but the big year is 1789, all right? It is not the US Constitution, as much as we like to think it is, all right? But y'all know what happened in I'll tell this story. I once did an escape room, and you know what an escape room is? It's where you go, and it was with some friends. It was fun. I had been useless the entire time. Okay, I'm like not good at puzzles like that. My friends were all figuring out all the different things, and I didn't get it. And about a minute and a half left, they got that the clue was the way to get out of the escape room was the year of the French Revolution. And they're all looking at each other like, who knows the year of the French Revolution? And I waltz up to the door and push 1789, and we're out, all right? So the French, 1789, most important year so far, all right, in the story, all right? The French Revolution radically brings all of this to a head. Because all of these things that had been brewing over about 100 or 200 years officially broke this apart, all right? And King Louis was alive for a little bit, and then, right, and the birth of the French Republic happened. Now, it didn't last for that long, but Napoleon spreads the ideas out. And across all of Europe, wherever Napoleon goes, before we get to Napoleon, the French Revolution, when they were meeting in Paris in 1789, they had an argument. Are Jews French? Okay? It was a hot question, all right? And they initially answered actually no, all right? And then they realized, yeah, you can't really actually believe all these things and then also say that Jewish people aren't also French. So Jews are, the word that academics use is that Jews are emancipated. Jews, in a couple months into the French Revolution, not day one, but a few months into it, are broken officially out of this structure and are able to be their own independent people, all right? When Jews are emancipated, all sorts of questions come up then. And Napoleon, a few years later, actually gathers a group of Jews together. He calls them a Sanhedrin, which we didn't talk about, but is a Jewish court, the Jewish Supreme Court. He gathers a group of Jews of France and makes them answer 12 questions, all right, including, can a Jewish person marry a non-Jewish person, all right? Will a Jewish person serve in the French army, even if that means they might go to war against a Jewish person serving in the Prussian army? All right? Not only is Napoleon curious about the answer to that, the Jews are not sure what to do. They've been living in this kind of weird corporate structure for a long time, and suddenly they're broken out of it. They don't give one answer. Jews give a lot of different answers. I'm going to give you 6 of them, all right? But there's huge questions that Jews are suddenly having to ask as a result of being emancipated. And Napoleon, when he conquers most of Europe, all right, along the way emancipates the Jews everywhere he goes. When he loses, some places emancipate their Jews, some places unemancipate them. Most keep their Jews emancipated, all right? By 1861, Jews are emancipated all over Europe. The Russians were the last to do it, and 1861 is really the final year where every Jewish person is free to make their own decisions. That is a huge change for Jewish life, all right? If you want to understand modern Judaism, the fundamental thing you need to know is that it is all a response to the questions that are asked by the French Revolution. Now, I told you I'm going to give you 6 responses here, all right? And the first of those, and this is, we're getting at myth number 1 here, all right? The first of those was a group of people who about 20 years later said, you know, us Jews, we've been doing some things that are a little old school. And we look around at our neighbors and we see some things that they're doing, and we're a little stuck in our ways, and We no longer have the control of the rabbis that we used to have. We want to try doing some new things. So let's give one example. There's this new thing called a coffee shop. Can a Jewish person go and have a meal in a coffee shop? The food might not be kosher, but can a Jewish person go and sit with their maybe non-Jewish friends and talk about ideas there? Or how about this one? The non-Jewish people have this lovely instrument in their services. It's called an organ. Should we bring an organ into our services? How would that be? Or what about this one? The sermons are all in this weird old language. What if we updated the sermons and gave them in a language that people actually speak? Fun fact about Temple Emanu-El, when they were hiring their first rabbi at Temple Emanu-El of Dallas in 1890 whatever, there were two candidates, and one of them gave the sermon in English, and the other one gave the sermon in German, and they were like, we're not going with the guy who speaks English, right? The community all spoke German. They were all immigrants from Germany. They wanted to speak, they spoke German, and they wanted their rabbi to speak German to them. The language the rabbi spoke was important. If a rabbi showed up here and was primarily a Russian speaker, y'all probably be like, yeah, I don't really fully get what he's saying in Russian, or maybe some of his ideas have a little weird, wonky Russianisms in them. We want a rabbi who speaks our language and thinks the way we do, all right? These people are all answering this question of how do we balance modern life and Jewish tradition, okay? The book that we give the people in the intro class, do any of you have it with you tonight? Maybe I'll bring that book. It's called, yes, what's it called? Modernity. Honoring tradition and embracing modernity. All right? The Reform Movement's book. This is Reform. All right? Orthodoxy, the Reformers were the first people that said, we care about being Jewish still, but we also want to live in the modern world. I'm going to ask the question in another way in about 3 minutes about baseball and blue jeans, all right? That's in like the 1810s, all right? The Reformers are getting going in the 1810s. Sorry, my handwriting is terrible and this black pen is running out. I'm going to go to the red one. What do you think was the response to the Reformers? No, right? Not full-blown no yet, by the way, but in the 1830s, led by a guy named Samson Raphael Hirsch, there's a group called Modern Orthodoxy, all right? Modern Orthodoxy is different than something else, all right? Modern Orthodoxy, what does the name tell you, all right? Huh? No, I'm going to get to confusion. The top half isn't that confused. The bottom half is super confused, okay? Well, part of the bottom half. The modern Orthodox might look at the Reform and say, you're embracing a little too much modernity. We agree with you that modernity is important. We also want to live in the modern world, but we want to hold on to Jewish traditions a little more tightly. So let's give an example. Let's use an American one. Let's go to a baseball game, all right? The modern Orthodox Jew and the Reform Jew are both happy at the baseball game, all right? The Reform Jew might eat something the modern Orthodox Jew isn't going to eat. The modern Orthodox Jew might pack their own bag of food, all right, because they're not going to eat the Trafee, the Dodger dog is, well, right? They're not going to eat the potentially pork-filled hot dog, all right? And the Reform Jew might say, I'm a little more comfortable eating whatever at the game. But both still Jewish. Both still like going to their shuls. Now, the Reform Jew might even say, I'll go on Saturday, all right? Or maybe at least I'll bring my radio into the synagogue on Saturday so I can find out how the baseball game went, all right? So you have here these kind of dueling answers to the same question, which is how much do I embrace this new modern world and how much do I hold on to Jewish tradition? There's a group in the middle. What's the group in the middle? Conservative Jews, all right? Conservative Jews. y'all probably are going to sit here and be like, I want to be a conservative Jew now. They say, we want to have our cake and eat it too. And they really get going in like the 1850s and 1860s, all right? And conservative Jews say, no, you can do both of these things. You can be a modern person and you can be a good Jewish person. And in fact, Judaism is built on that. I'm going to give you an example. The problem is, with conservative Judaism, with which I grew up, I did USY, I went to a Jewish day school that was conservative. I lived in a lot in the conservative world. And to be completely honest, I think much of the modern Jewish world is living right here or right here, okay? Y'all are all somewhere in here, okay? And other people are over here. And there are not a ton of, and there are people here. We'll get to there in a second. Let's give another example here. Women as rabbis, okay? All right, so there is a concept that emerges kind of naturally out of the modern period called feminism, which says, well, wait a minute, if you want to treat all people equally, what about like this one very obvious group of people that have been living in our society the entire time and are half the population, women, right? And feminism emerges not long after the French Revolution as this radical, crazy concept that women should be considered equal too, right? And in Judaism, that is going to break a lot of old norms. And the reformers say, you know what? We like this. Mordecai Kaplan, from the beginning of the class, has this crazy new thing for his daughter in 1922. Instead of having just men read Torah, he says, my daughter's going to read Torah too. She's going to have a bat mitzvah, okay? That's in 1922, first modern bat mitzvah, all right? So the reformers say, yeah, we should have women be rabbis. The modern Orthodox say, no. That is too much radical craziness, newness. The problem with conservative Judaism is that they often kind of waffle for 25 years and then make a decision and piss off half their members along the way, okay? And it drives people either in one direction or the other. The conservative synagogue where I grew up had a huge argument over instruments in the services, and they landed on, we'll do it on Friday night, but we won't do it on Saturday morning. And if you're more modern Orthodox, you're like, I'm just going to go to the modern Orthodox synagogue, okay? So these are the three main groups that are answering this question of how do I balance the modern world and tradition. By the way, what does this sound like from the second class? Hellenism. When Hellenism came through, these were the exact same questions that Jews were asking and arguing about. I have 3 more slots here, though. So what do we think those other 3 slots are? Good. I'm going to use the word ultra-Orthodox. One of the things that I can't stand is that when people picture a Jew, they picture one of these people, all right? Huh? Oh, the podium's in your way. That probably helps the folks online, too. All right? So what are the ultra-Orthodox saying? If these people are all arguing about balancing modernity and tradition, what are the ultra-Orthodox doing? They're rejecting modernity. It's not that they're saying tradition's more important, because that is up there. They're rejecting, don't get a cell phone that has access to the internet. It's scary. This is our version in some ways of an Amish response, right? This is people who are looking at huge changes in the world in a short amount of time and freaking out about them. And to give a little bit of kavod to the ultra-Orthodox, which I almost never do, a little bit of me gets it. There are some ways in which it's nice in the shtetl. You don't have to deal with people's identity and what happens when they marry someone who isn't Jewish and these questions that we all have to grapple with. They're just like, I'm not going to the baseball game, right? I like baseball, so I don't like that answer. But it's a real, genuine response to saying that the modern world is full of scary things, and we like things better in the old world. Now, the reason ultra-Orthodox people dress the way they dress is not because that's how Moses dressed on Mount Sinai, or even how Moses Maimonides dressed in Egypt. The way that they dress is how Jewish people dressed in Eastern Europe in 1789. They are trying to freeze Jewish life in a particular period of time. Now, in Jewish history, This is not the first people to do this, okay? And this group of people doesn't survive, right? The whole idea of we're going to keep things so cultishly tight that no one is ever going to be able to embrace any aspect of the modern world runs up into the challenge of meeting the modern world. In modern Israel, the issue where this emerges is the army. Because the minute ultra-Orthodox people join the army, it means they're going to get exposed to other people. And when they're exposed to other people, their whole way of thinking is going to crumble, because some of them are going to say, okay, none of them are going to say baseball is fun, because Israelis don't like baseball, but they're going to do their version of the equivalent of, wow, that music is cool, right? All right, so that's the ultra-Orthodoxy. There are some people that are living here. By the way, something about ultra-Orthodoxy, all of ultra-Orthodoxy is very tight-knit communities that's hard to leave, except for one group. And the joke among ultra-Orthodox is, what's the religion most like your own? But that's not yours, Chabad, okay? Chabad is an outward-facing ultra-Orthodox group. That is literally an oxymoron, because you can't reject modernity and also be outward-facing in the modern world unless things are going quite awry in a society. So Chabad has this kind of weird spot that like goes over here. That's a different class, and I have lots of feelings about Chabad, and I should say none of them on the record. There's another group here. What's the opposite of the ultra-Orthodox? Ultra-modernist. I'm going to call this people who extreme assimilationists to the point of conversion, all right? Converting out. Of the 6 groups, this is the biggest group. Reconstructionist is not, it fits in between Reform and Conservative. It's not drastically ideologically different. It's more about structure as opposed to ideology. The largest of these groups is this one right here. The vast majority of Jews, not the vast majority, but the plurality of Jews looked at the emancipation of Jewish people and said, see ya, I'm out. I'm going to go become Christian, okay? In the Warsaw Ghetto, there was an actively operating Catholic church because Jewish people had converted to Catholicism and they were happy about it. And the Nazis said, nah, you're a race, you have a drop of Jewish blood, you belong in that ghetto, even if you say you're Christian, right? But there were a lot of Jews in a short amount of time who converted to Christianity and are living in Europe today, all right? It's kind of sad to think that this is the number one response, but it really is, all right? People who said, I'm done with this whole Jewish thing. I am going to just embrace the modern world, and I'm going to reject my tradition entirely. Yeah. That's not a real thing. I covered that in the last class, yeah.
There are people going the other way.
Yeah. That's a different class. Yeah. I can't deal with Chabad when there's a camera on. Sorry. You come talk to me afterwards. I'll give you my thoughts. There's a 6th group here. And it doesn't quite belong where it belongs. I don't have a good spot for it, but there's an obvious spot for it. Any ideas on what this 6th group is? No. No. They end up becoming Reformed, Conservative, or Modern Orthodox because they end up having to ask the same questions, like, how do I deal with this? Someone said it over here. Zionism. There's a group of people that look at all of this and say, you people are all crazy because they're never going to accept you. They're never going to allow you to live in their society the way that you think you're going to. All right? Unfortunately, as Dr. Morshauer just said, they're probably right. The Holocaust kind of proves the Zionists a little bit right here. But they look at these people who are trying to say, I'm a good German Jew, or I'm a good French Jew. All right? Yeah, it didn't work, right? Herzl, did I write it down? Oh, I didn't write it down. Theodor Herzl, I'm sorry I didn't bring the quote with me. Maybe I'll email it to you. Theodor Herzl is over here, all right? He is like on the cusp of converting out, and he encounters one particular moment. The story's a little more complicated than this, but I'm going to give you the story we tell version. There is a French Jewish general by the name of Alfred Dreyfus in the 1890s, and Dreyfus was accused of being a spy for Germany. Émile Zola wrote this very famous headline, "J'accuse," and it was about this argument that boiled in France in the 1890s about whether or not Dreyfus was being accused of being a spy because he was Jewish or not. And the answer is probably, well, no, the answer is yes. He was innocent. They've done posthumous research. They've done all sorts of things in his day. They kind of were like, yeah, he was not a spy, but he was blamed as being a spy. It was predicated on the fact that he was Jewish, and a lot of people, including Theodor Herzl, say the only answer here is that just like French people have a French state, and Polish people have a Polish state, and German people are going to have some sort of weird German confederation that's going to be eventually called a German state, we Jewish people, the only way we can live in the modern world is having a Jewish state, right? Which is where Zionism is born. Now, it isn't initially actually specifically connected to the land. There were some people who said there should be a little Jewish state in Eastern Europe. There were other people who said, why don't we go to Uganda, because that feels like a good, easy spot to go to. There were all sorts of places that were thrown out. But by 1903, it's decided that the movement of people who say, all y'all are crazy, and it's not going to work. We have to go to one spot. They land on that being the land of Israel. Now, and here's the kicker, and is that the state of Israel was founded despite the fact that the Holocaust happened. All right? The Holocaust killed a lot of people who should have been people who would have gone to found the Jewish state. All right? And even though the Holocaust happened, the Jewish state still emerged. And as a response to this, all right? So that's why I say it's a myth that Israel is not founded because of the Holocaust. The Holocaust had an impact on Israel's founding, of course, but the ideas that were behind the foundation of the state of Israel are a part of this question of how do we respond to the modern world. Now, I learned this from Rabbi Michael Marmer, who some of you have seen speak here at Temple. I call these here the 6 responses to the modern Jewish world. I like to judge some of them, for sure. Okay, I know where I land. I know where I live in this circle, somewhere in it. Depends which side of the line, depends on the day. But that's where I live, all right? And yet, it's hard to judge anyone for going in any of those spots because they're all legitimate responses to this question of what do we do when we're suddenly free? I don't think this is going to last like this forever. We could even argue that the modern world has ended and the new thing has started. But for those who are still living in American Jewish life, the contours of our community are this is what it looks like, and this is the argument that we are still having. With my last minute, I didn't leave too much time for questions. I'll stick around and do a few questions afterwards. I'll say the one challenge to the Zionists who are challenging the deal with the modernity and tradition, I think, is the United States. Because at the same time as all of this was happening, a bunch of people picked their butts up and moved and went to either Galveston or Ellis Island. And you have the birth of the American Jewish community, which had really been sputtering in its start, but really gets going when a bunch of people move between the years 1881 and 1921. Should I tell you the reason for those years? 1881, someone killed the Tsar in Russia. The person was Jewish, and they blamed the Jews, which one person was Jewish, but doesn't mean you need to blame the whole community. A bunch of pogroms happened, and so you started to see Jews leaving. In 1921 is when the United States started clamping down on immigration, all right? So that period of time is where the vast majority of modern American Jews, when they and their families come to the United States. And the question out here is sort of, as Europe loses, the people who say, I want to balance modernity and tradition in Europe, they can't really do it much because the communities are basically all wiped out. The American Jewish community emerges as a response to saying, no, we can actually still figure out how to live authentic and real and genuine Jewish lives, figuring out this question of balancing modernity and balancing our tradition. I'm going to leave it at that. And the reason I'm going to leave it at that and not go into any of the more modern stuff is that that feels like a spot where I hope over the course of the 3 sessions, you've seen that Jews argue about a lot of different things. And what we argue about are, in many ways, the fundamental aspects of our identity. They're not new. All right, these questions that we're asking today of who's Jewish, or how do we relate to our community, or how do we balance modernity and tradition, or am I a real Jew even though I don't know the entire Torah, or all questions like that, you're not the first one to be asking them. Jews for 3,000 years have been asking different iterations of these questions from the Exodus in Egypt on forward. And I hope you've had a chance to explore a couple of the different perspectives that people have had over the last 3,000 years. And each and every one of you will continue to be a part of answering that question in your own way and trying to figure out where your spot is and how to see your spot vis-a-vis all the other ones. I'll conclude with one more line. There's a teaching I love from the Baal Shem Tov, who is an Eastern European Hasidic master. And the Baal Shem Tov said that every single Jewish person is a letter, and every single community is a line, and every single generation is a paragraph. And all those letters and all those lines and all those paragraphs come together to tell the story that is the story of the Jewish people. And so that each of you are in your own ways a letter in the scroll of this story. The paragraph that we are in is dealing with this iteration of the question. It's not a fully new paragraph. It's connected to the paragraphs before. But I hope you see your spot as a letter in that scroll. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.